Last time we were talking about Rome, and we talked about the Roman Republic. I ended up telling you about the assassination of Julius Caesar. This is then going to usher in a kind of civil war. Those who choose to be on the side of Julius Caesar, and he was quite popular with people because he made himself a man of the common people. At least that was the way he portrayed himself. And so many people were upset when he was assassinated. They were not pleased. Others, of course, said, no, we are defending the Roman Republic, and that's what we're doing here. And so they were called then the Republicans, or the defenders of the Republic. And the other side were called the defenders of Caesar, or the Caesarians. So you have the Caesarians versus the Republicans, or the defenders of the Republic. On the Caesarian side, you have a guy by the name of Mark Antony. Mark Antony was a long-time friend, colleague of Julius Caesar. In fact, he was a well-known military leader of his own who had fought side by side with Julius Caesar. Octavian, on the other hand, was unknown. Octavian, anybody know where he came from?
Wasn't his name changed?
His name will be changed
Augustus.
to Augustus Caesar. Yeah, you're stealing my story at the end. But yes, that's right. So, but, we know him as Caesar Augustus later on. But here he's called Octavian. Octavian was a relative of Julius Caesar, a nephew. Julius Caesar had put him in his will, so to speak, to be his heir. And so he kind of comes out of nowhere. People don't know him. He wasn't in Rome. He wasn't a military guy. He was pretty young. And most people thought they could kind of dismiss him because, this guy didn't have any experience. Where'd this guy come from? Julius Caesar must not have updated his will. That kind of thing. But, of course, they do underestimate him. Well, on the other side, those who defend the Republic, or the Republicans, especially Brutus and Cassius. Brutus, and we mentioned Brutus last time. Remember, Brutus had been Caesar's good friend, but he had felt his friend had gone too far. And so he was involved in the assassination as well, and stabbing of Julius Caesar, along with Cassius. Well, I don't know if you like spoiler alerts, but here's a spoiler alert. The Caesarians win. We don't have time to go through all the details, but they do fight. There's actually a large battle north of the city of Philippi. You probably heard of Philippi. If you ever read the Bible, as I recommend you do someday, you might find in it a book called Philippians. That book is named for the city of Philippi. And it was famous in this time for the Battle of Philippi, which was a battle between the Caesarians and the Republicans, in which the Caesarians win. By the way, Octavius is sick. He doesn't go to the battle. That doesn't help out his street cred too much. Mark Antony is the one who leads the battle, defeats Brutus and Cassius. Brutus and Cassius then, rather than being taken captive, decide to do what? Anybody know? Kill themselves. Fall on your sword. You ever heard anybody say you need to fall on your sword? Well, hopefully you'll never hear anybody say that, but that means, like if in business or something, you fall on your sword, that means you're going out. You're going down. So that's what they did. They committed suicide by putting their sword out there and falling on their sword, literally, that will kill them. This was thought to be better than being taken captive and then executed later, because you would be humiliated for weeks, months, literally dragged through the streets of Rome. You know, people would be throwing stuff at you, and all kinds of stuff would happen. You know, you'd probably get beat up and stuff. So this was considered to be sort of the easier of the two ways to die. So that's what they did. All right, so that's the end of that. Battle of Philippi. Okay, so what does that leave then? Well, now it leaves two guys, Octavian and Mark Antony. They've gotten rid of the competition, but guess what? There's a principle in history that says, my enemy's enemy is my friend. So Mark Antony and Octavian were friends in that they had a common enemy. Well, once that common enemy is gone, and this is what we see in history, when the common enemy is gone, then the people that were teamed up before, we start to see the differences between them, because they were teamed up to get rid of these guys. When these guys are gone, well, we haven't really thought about that. How's this going to work? Who's going to be in charge? What are we going to do? Now, they had tried to make an allegiance between it, because Mark Antony ended up marrying Octavian's sister, Octavia. They don't have a lot of first names in Rome, but her name was Octavia. And so he marries her, and this was to sort of seal the alliance between them. We're going to see, however, someone else enters this arena that drives a wedge between them. Anybody know what her name is?
Is it Cleopatra?
It is Cleopatra. Cleo. Yeah, Cleo
I
was...
remember that from the video.
Uh-huh. Cleo is an interesting lady. Well, the final days of the Republic then, Mark Antony and Octavian decide to, along with another guy named Lepidus, to form the second triumvirate, as it's called. The second triumvirate, by the way, is legal and it's open, not like the first one, which was illegal and secret. And they decide, we're going to divide things up. So Lepidus takes North Africa, Octavian takes the west, including Rome, and Mark Antony takes the east. Turkey, what today would be Turkey, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. So, as I told you, Octavia is married to Antony, the sister of Octavian. Now, when Mark Antony goes to the east to solidify his control there, I don't think his wife's with him. I think she's back in Rome, right? To be safer. And while he's there, he ends up meeting this lady named Cleopatra. Cleopatra had been friends with Julius Caesar. She met Julius Caesar. He was in his 50s. She was in her 20s, age-wise. And Julius Caesar came into Egypt and basically had taken it over. And Cleopatra was co-ruling with her brother. Her and her brother were not getting along. And Cleopatra had herself snuck into Julius Caesar's room, his quarters, by being rolled up in a rug, like a big carpet. So that, it's like they're carrying this carpet in to take it. Well, this is for Caesar's quarters. He ordered this carpet. And so then they get in there, and these guys, they unroll the carpet. There's Cleopatra right there. So, anyway, quite an entrance, I think. Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, to make the story shorter, become acquainted. And she invites him to sail on her barge, her ship, and sail up the Nile for a little cruise. And by the time they come back from the cruise, well, they are now very close friends. and the alliance between them is sealed. Okay? Eventually, you know, Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, by the way, Julius Caesar is also married. His wife's back in Rome. He will bring Cleopatra with him to Rome. This is very scandalous. And the people of Rome did not like her. They had a lot of names for her that I cannot repeat. And, you know, they had names they called her. They didn't like her. She becomes pregnant with Julius Caesar's child. It's a son. She gives birth to the son. His name is Caesarion. And so the idea here, I guess, is that this would be the heir to Julius Caesar's idea. But when he dies, unexpectedly, you know, it gets so bad for Cleopatra, she finally leaves Rome, goes back to Egypt with her son. And everything falls apart for Julius Caesar, you know. And now Mark Antony shows up. Well, she had met Mark Antony before. Mark Antony is actually not in Egypt at the time that they have their meeting. They meet in a place called Antioch, Antioch of Syria. Okay? There's a river there called the Orontes River, famous river. And of course, Cleopatra sailed there on her boat. So she says to Mark Antony, hey Mark Antony, hey Mark, buddy, how you doing? How about you and I take a little trip on the Orontes River? And they do. And by the time they get back, they're very close friends. And they have formed an alliance between them. The idea here is, well, you know, obviously Julius Caesar and I were very close. You and Julius Caesar were close. And I have Caesar's son here, Caesarion. And Caesarion really ought to follow in his father's footsteps, don't you think, Mark Antony? Mark Antony agrees. And so a plan is hatched. What's the plan? We get rid of Octavius. Julius Caesar's friend and former mistress, or whatever you want to call her, will now rule Rome. So Mark Antony and Cleopatra will run Rome. And then when the child, the boy, gets old enough, he'll take over in his father's place. What could be better? This is certainly what Julius Caesar would have wanted. They think. So that's what happens. And they start down this path. Like I said, he's married to Octavius's sister, Octavia. So news of this gets back to Rome. They already don't like Cleopatra. They already say bad things about her. Guess what? They're going to say more bad things about her. Some of them similar things that they said before. And how could this woman, you know, get these men to do what she wants? That's the sort of kind version of what they would say. Okay? So, that's what happens. And so the two of them then go into battle. They join forces and they fight Octavian. And they think, well, we can take Octavian. He's just a punk kid. He doesn't have much experience. We're going to have my military experience on Mark Antony. Cleopatra, of course, has a pretty good navy and an army herself. We can join forces. We can defeat Octavian. And we'll take over. And then little baby Caesarion will grow up in a manner that's fitting him, and then he will become ruler in the place of his father. All right, so that's the plan in a nutshell. Doesn't work. Spoiler alert, doesn't work that way, as you probably know. So we see, we don't have time to talk about all of it, but they have a big battle at a place called Actium. Actium is in Greece. It's mainly a naval battle. The naval forces kind of get trapped in the harbor, and Octavian surprises them there, begins to defeat a lot of their ships. When Cleopatra sees what's happening. She decides to get out of town. So she takes some of her boats and heads for Egypt. Mark Antony stays and fights for a while, and he sees it's all lost, so he takes his boat and he goes to Egypt as well. By the time they get there, of course, Octavian is going to be chasing them, and he will, of course, want to kill them. But before that happens, they both commit suicide. Cleopatra commits suicide by the use of a poison snake called an asp. You gotta say it very carefully. Asp. A-S-P. And so she reportedly held the snake up, let it bite her, kind of in the neck, so that the poison would go quickly around her body. And then Mark Antony realizes later what happened to her, and then he kills himself. That's very tragic, isn't it?
How does he kill himself?
Sword. Yeah, he uses
So
the
he
sword.
falls on the sword.
Falls on the sword. And then by the time Octavian gets there, they're both dead.
Wow.
And so this is how Octavian then comes to control the entire territory of Rome. All right, so that's the last days of the Republic, and that's sort of where we didn't quite get there last time. But here we can see, for example, there's Tarsus, and Antioch is right over here. This is where Mark Antony and Cleopatra meet. Here's Alexandria. That's really where Julius Caesar and Cleopatra meet. The Battle of Actium, not shown here, but it'll be right about here. Right? Philippi, as you might know, is right about there, right about where the O is of Macedonia. All right, and so now what we see is that this territory that's in green, the lighter green, it's kind of hard to see here, but the lighter green is the territory of Rome at about this time, okay, when Octavian comes to power. So now we can say the Roman Empire begins with the reign of Octavian. And as we've already said, Octavian is going to change his name to Augustus, Caesar Augustus. He's going to take his uncle's name as a title. And so this is where we see Caesar becoming a title. We'll say that these are, the Caesars then are the emperors of Rome. But it's taken from Julius Caesar's name. By the way, that same name, Caesar, continues on much later. Perhaps you would know that the leader of Russia for a long time was called the Tsar, right? The name Tsar comes from the name Caesar. Perhaps you have heard that at one time the leader of Germany was called the Kaiser. Kaiser comes from the name Caesar, and so forth. Okay, so there's a lot of this stuff. We can tie it back to Julius Caesar. We can tie it back to this sort of thing. So then Octavian becomes Caesar Augustus. He comes to power in 31 BC. He will rule until 14 AD. So this is a reign of 45 years. So while Julius Caesar may have sort of set the stage for the empire, he didn't end up living very long and ruling very long in comparison with Caesar Augustus, who really sets the model and sort of sets up the empire. He was a very popular leader. He ends up being very popular, in part because of his attitude, because of the way he lived. Romans, wealthy Romans, lived usually a very lavish lifestyle, right? They would eat very interesting foods that were very expensive and hard to get. For example, peacock tongues. You ever had peacock tongues for dinner? Well, a peacock, by the way, doesn't have a very big tongue. So if you're going to make a meal out of peacock tongues, you're going to need an awful lot of peacocks, right? But this was a delicacy that Romans would eat. Peacock tongues. Another thing that Romans liked to eat, it was a delicacy, mice, dormice. Okay, dormice. The dormice, these aren't any ordinary mice. They would raise them in a box, and they would feed them milk. Milk-fed dormice were supposed to be the best. And you would serve those at dinner as well. Fancy dinners. It had other kinds of indulgent foods and drink. We can't go through the whole list, but there are Roman cookbooks you could look up and see the kind of stuff they would eat. Now, this isn't what normal, I guess I would say, everyday Romans would eat. Probably a lot of them never had a peacock's tongue because that was just too expensive and, it's not going to happen. What did most of them eat? Most of them ate grain, wheat, bulgur wheat boiled, and bread. Bread, a kind of porridge made out of wheat, maybe some meat, but they wouldn't have a lot of meat. They would have meat maybe a couple times a week, right? Lamb, sheep, or a lot of times fish. Fish would be one of their cheaper meat that they could get a hold of. And anyway, Caesar Augustus was said to eat simple meals. This is what was reported. He would just have the regular porridge like everybody else and bread. And then he lived in a pretty modest house. He didn't have an elaborate, fancy house. In other words, he tried to identify with the people through this, at least this image of him being a regular guy. See? A man of the people. He's not going to fancy parties and eating peacock tongues. He is just eating bread and porridge and maybe some fish like we do. Okay? So that's part of the way he tried to identify with the people. He was quite popular. He did expand the territory, and he stabilized the borders, and he brought peace. He brought peace to Rome. This is what it came to be called Pax Romana. P-A-X, Pax. Pax Romana means the peace of Rome. And you remember they'd had many years, at least about 100 years of upheaval in Rome. Civil wars, generals fighting each other. This has been going on for a long time. And now we have this guy in place. He seems like a regular guy. He seems like a guy who can be in charge. And he seems like he's stabilized things. And our economy's doing better. And we have peace. So they liked him. And the peace of Rome would allow Rome to stabilize, which they needed. Now here is a statue. You see the head, the face of Augustus. By the way, all of his statues look about like this. I mean, he never gets past about 25 in his statues, 25, 30 maybe. In other words, as he gets older, there's no statue of him being older. Why? You don't want to appear older. He wants to appear youthful, powerful. Okay, so he does, even though he lives to a pretty old age. All of his statues, all of his portraits, they all, I mean, once you kind of get to know it, you can just recognize it when you see it, because it doesn't really change much at all from one to the other. So this is the territory then in the green that eventually the Romans will control. At the time of Caesar Augustus, they did not control England yet. They didn't control some of these outlying areas, but they controlled a lot all around the Mediterranean. And what Caesar Augustus advised them to do was to not expand anymore. This is what, of course, they didn't follow that advice. Not expand anymore. The borders are stable. We're at peace. Develop what we have. Don't go seeking other territories like up here in Germany like they did, up here in England, over here in Parthia and Mesopotamia. Leave that stuff alone. But of course, eventually they don't listen to him. Now we come to the early empire period. Of course, we got Caesar Augustus. So I want in fairly rapid order to give you the list and maybe just a few things about the emperors up through the first century. Okay? These are called the Julio-Claudian. Julio from Julius Caesar and Claudian from the Emperor Claudius. It goes from 14 to 69 AD. Okay? The successor to Caesar Augustus is Tiberius. By the way, if you've ever read that thing called the New Testament, some of these names are going to show up, right? I recommend you do if you haven't, or go back and do it again. You'll see that Caesar Augustus' name comes about around the time of the birth of Christ, because he is the ruler, and he has called for a census. You remember? Well, we're coming up to Christmas time here in a couple of months. They'll probably read that story somewhere, you'll see it. And the census. We've got a census coming up next year. You know what a census is all about? Taxes. It's about the government getting money. Don't let them fool you. They got to make sure they know how many people there are to make sure everybody's paying enough. And think up new creative ways to get your money. Well, anyway, I won't say any more about that. But that's what it was about. That's why they got started. The Romans did it. That's why we do it, really, although we claim it's for other reasons now. So that happens during the time of Caesar Augustus. During the reign of Tiberius, this is the ministry of Christ. So Jesus is born during the reign of Caesar Augustus, but remember, he doesn't really begin what we call his ministry, his work, until about the year 30. Now, some people debate plus or minus a year or two there, but it's definitely happening during the reign of Tiberius, later in the reign of Tiberius. Okay? So most likely when they hold up a coin, Peter says, should we be paying these taxes? He's kind of like me. Should we really be paying these taxes? Jesus said, well, take that coin. Who's on the coin? Well, Caesar. This is probably the Caesar, Tiberius. And he says, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and give unto God what is God's. Okay, well, there you go. There's your Bible verse for the day. All right. That's probably had the picture of Tiberius. It's either him or Augustus Caesar, but by this time, chances are the coins are from Tiberius. Now, following Tiberius, by the way, Tiberius was a reluctant emperor, I think. He didn't really want the job, and Caesar Augustus really didn't want to give him the job. He tried to give it to about anybody else, but they all kept dying. And I can't go through the whole list, but there was about 4 or 5 people who died. And so finally, Tiberius, who, by the way, was an adopted son of Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus, he was married twice. He had a wife. She didn't have a son. They used to think, by the way, that if you didn't have a son, it was the woman's fault. They thought certain women had sons and certain women didn't have sons. And so if you were married to a woman who did not produce a son, well, get a different woman. So they often liked to marry a woman who already had a son, which his second wife did, and that was Tiberius. Well, and his brother. She had 2 sons. Augustus wanted to give it to his brother, but then his brother died because his brother was sort of more outgoing and so forth. Anyway, it's a long story, but that was the idea. If you're going to marry a second wife to get a son, well, it's good that she's already had a son or 2. That shows she's the kind of woman that has sons. But never had a son with Augustus Caesar. He did have a daughter with his first wife. Julia, well, we can't talk about her. She was scandalous. She did not want to listen to her father. I'm sure all of you in here want to listen to your fathers. You're very obedient. You never do things you aren't supposed to do. Be home by midnight. You're always home at 11:30. You're home at 11. I don't really even want to go out, but okay. I guess I'm supposed to. Right? Julia was not that kind of a lady. She was known to be a little bit wild. Wild. Now, I don't know about you. Have you ever known anybody in here the child of a minister, a preacher? 1, 2, 3, 4. Thank you. I see those hands. 5. Now, what are the reputation of ministers' children? That they're all very nice, very follow all the rules. They're a good example for every other young person in the congregation. No? Okay, well, that was the reputation of Julia. She was supposed to be the good girl. She was supposed to be the person that followed all the rules because her father made all the rules. And he wanted her to be a good example to everyone. But guess what? She did not want that. And so she wasn't that. Okay? All right. I digressed. We're going past Tiberius now. By the way, she ends up, just to kind of finish the story, being exiled by her father to a remote area of what today would be Turkey. And it was ordered that no men could come visit her and that she could have no wine. Okay? Just to give you an idea of how maybe fathers and daughters don't always get along. That's what she was sentenced. She wasn't sent to prison. I mean, I'm sure she thought of it as prison. She was just sent to a remote house in a remote area, and the guards were said, look, no men can come visit her. No man can come visit her. And she can have no wine. Have all the food she wants, but no wine. Drink water, I guess. It's supposed to be good for you. All right, how about Caligula? Well, we can't say too much about Caligula. You can look him up if you want, but he was a scandalous guy. He doesn't last very long, about 4 years, Caligula. Caligula, by the way, kind of went nuts. A lot of people think crazy, loony. I don't know what the proper word is. I'm probably not supposed to say crazy. He had mental issues. There we go. That's better, right? I'd say he had a lot of mental issues. For example, he deified his horse. This is one of the things he did. He really liked his horse a lot. And he deified his horse. Said his horse was a god. You know, I have a little puppy named Xerxes. I think he's divine, in a sense. I haven't deified him yet, but, you know. For example, there were a lot of hills in Rome. And so he didn't think, you know, he didn't really think his horse liked going down the hill and coming back up. So he had a bridge built between the two hills so his horse could just walk straight across. I'm sure the horse appreciated it. Anyway, he ended up marrying his sister. That was a bit scandalous. He did lots of things we can't go into. Now, when he is kind of persuaded to die by his, he commits suicide, but it's sort of forced, right? Like a lot of these things where you say, oh, these guys committed suicide. Well, if the guy is sort of forcing you to do it, is that really suicide? Well, I guess that's assisted suicide. Okay, anyway. So that's what happens to him. And then the Praetorian Guard is supposed to be protecting the emperor's side. We can get rid of this Caligula guy. This guy's crazy. And then they saw a guy hiding in the curtains because he's afraid because the guards come in. And he was a guy who walked with a limp. He had sort of a disability when he walked. He also had one when he talked. He kind of talked. He couldn't talk well. And so most people, and this is what happens sometimes when somebody has disabilities, and sometimes people think they aren't thinking well, right? If he doesn't talk well, maybe he's not thinking well. And so the guards thought, we're going to choose this guy because we can control him. And that was Claudius. But Claudius turned out to be quite intelligent and actually a pretty good ruler. His problem was ladies. As is often the problem. Ladies. He married a woman. Well, he married his niece. He had married another woman. He liked the ladies a little bit younger than him. We can't go into all of that. But one of them that he married had sons. And she was really wanting her son to be the next emperor and tried to encourage that. So she poisoned him. She ended up poisoning him.
Because she wanted him to be the emperor?
No, she poisoned Claudius so her son could be the emperor. Yeah, I should be clearer. Yes. She poisoned him with a mushroom. Now, it wasn't a poison mushroom, as I hear somebody say. She put the poison on the mushroom because he liked to eat mushrooms. And mushrooms soak stuff up, and he ate the mushrooms, and that was it for him. So then that brings our next really nice ruler. His name is Nero. That's how Nero comes to power. His mother was a forceful lady, I guess would be fair to say. She's a lady that likes to take charge, right? Like killing her husband so her son could become emperor, because she wanted to be the mother of the emperor, and he was going to be really young, so that kind of meant she would have a lot of power. See how that works? If your son's like 12, and he's the emperor, and you're the emperor's mother, you're going to have a lot of influence, a lot of power. That's what she wanted. He also had got him a tutor. His tutor's name was Seneca. Seneca was a well-known philosopher, orator kind of guy. And between the two of them, they sort of controlled Nero in the beginning of his reign. But as he got older, he decided he didn't want either one of them around. So, had him killed. So Nero killed his own mother. Well, not with his bare hands. He had somebody else do it. He actually tried to kill her 2 or 3 times. He set up a way to make it look like an accident, but she just wouldn't die. She just wouldn't die. One of the things that he did, he knew where she would be sleeping, right? Okay, this is the room where she sleeps. So he ordered guys to go up into the rafters with saws and cut the beams so that the beams would collapse on top of her bed and kill her while she was in bed, while she was asleep. It did collapse on top of her bed, but it didn't kill her. He knew that she really wasn't a swimmer, and so she was going to go, he had it arranged so she would have to go from place to place in a small boat because something happened, we got to move her from here to here. So she gets in this small boat, and it was set up that the guy in the boat would make sure the boat sank, the small boat would sink, and then he would just swim away and leave her.
So it had a hole in it or something?
Yeah, I think he put a hole in it, and then he kind of, swamped it, and it started to go down, and that guy in the rush just got out of there. But somebody else saved her, so he just couldn't get rid of her. So finally, he just had to stab her. Yes.
What was her name?
I believe her name was Agrippina. Agrippina.
After all of those attempts, did she not get the point, like her son?
Well, eventually she got the point.
Okay.
It was a dagger of some kind. He finally just... So, even for an emperor to kill your mother was considered to be maybe something you shouldn't do. So he was then guilty of matricide, the killing of your mother, right? Matricide is not stabbing your mattress. He, in this case, stabbed his mother. So, well, there's a lot of stories here, and I'm getting off on these stories, so we're not going to maybe get through everything like I'd like. But he kind of goes a little crazy after his mother, and then he had Seneca put to death by forcing him to commit suicide. And so then he's just on his own. He's in his 20s and he's just kind of nuts and he's just doing whatever he wants. People have been controlling me my whole life. I'm going to do what I want. Now this is the guy to which Paul is sent when he says, I appeal to Caesar with my case. Remember that? That's in the Bible, by the way. Book of Acts, you can check it there. This is the emperor. He's going before Nero. So Paul met Nero. We know that much. At least once. Maybe twice. And in the beginning, most people believe Paul was released the first time, but then arrested again, and this time executed. Both Peter and Paul were executed in 67. The other big event that happens here in 64 is a great fire in Rome, which Nero blames on the Christians. And many Christians are then put to death. And that probably means that when Paul was first arrested, it was before 64. And the second time he was arrested was after 64. And according to Eusebius, an early church historian, both Peter and Paul are executed in Rome in the year 67. Paul, since he was a Roman citizen, could not be crucified because Roman citizens could not die in such a cruel way. So Paul was beheaded. Cut his head off. It's a lot quicker and less painful, relatively speaking. But Peter, of course, was not a Roman citizen, so he was crucified. But according to Eusebius, he requested to not be crucified in the same way as his Lord. So he was crucified upside down and with a different kind of cross, a cross that's kind of like an X rather than like a T. So the X cross is called Peter, St. Peter's cross. Okay? All right.
Isn't the thing that cut their head off was like a guillotine or something like that?
Well, the guillotine is actually a later invention. So what they would use here is a sword.
Okay.
They would get a really sharp sword and get a guy and kind of put him on a wooden block and just, I guess if we want to talk about it, that's what they did. Okay? So, you read in Romans where Paul says that the government does not have the sword for nothing. You read about that? That, the government has power and so forth, and the government does not have the sword for nothing. What Paul's talking about there is execution, capital punishment. The government has the power to execute. Well, you can look at it, examine it if you like. But that's what he's talking about. The sword, in that case, doesn't mean just, like soldiers going out with a sword. He's talking about the sword was the instrument, like we'd say the electric chair. Well, we don't use electric chair, I guess, anymore. We use lethal injections or whatever's done now. That's what he would have said. Okay. Well, we have to move on. Whoa, we're slowing down. Let's go to the next group of emperors now. After the death of Nero, there is a year of 4 emperors because people just really didn't like Nero and he was kind of crazy and did a lot of crazy stuff. So they put in like 3 older generals, and those guys all die off very quickly within a year. And then we finally, or 2 of them, then the 3rd general, so this would be the 4th emperor in 1 year, is Vespasian. Vespasian will be emperor for 10 years. He is a military man. He's a general. He had put down the Jewish rebellion. If you hear about the Jews who rebel against the Romans, and then we know that Jerusalem and the temple is destroyed in what year? Anybody know? No? 70, yes. AD 70 is when the temple is destroyed. It's destroyed actually by Vespasian's son that he leaves in charge. But he's pretty much got the rebellion put down. He leaves his son then to finish it. His son's name is Titus. And so Titus will be the one who will actually take over Jerusalem. So we'll see then Vespasian rules for 10 years. Then his son Titus comes into power. Titus only rules for 2 years, and then he dies. But Vespasian had started building a giant amphitheater that I know you have heard about. If you go to Rome, you're going to probably go see it. It's called the Colosseum. The Colosseum was built by Vespasian, dedicated by his son Titus. So its real name, or full name, would be the Flavian Amphitheater. But we just call it the Colosseum in Rome. Okay? Then he had another son. So there were two brothers. This is the older brother. Here's the younger brother, Domitian. Domitian ends up ruling 15 years. He rules longer than his father and brother combined. Domitian, by most accounts, is kind of a spoiled. He's kind of a bad guy, a rotten kind of guy. You know, Vespasian, one of the things that started to happen, even with Julius Caesar, is that after the death of the ruler, the Senate would often deify them, make them a god. Not all of them. Nero was not deified, so it wasn't automatic. But it could happen. So it happened to Julius Caesar, it happened to Caesar Augustus, I believe it happens to Tiberius. But it does not happen, of course, to Caligula or to Nero. But Vespasian was deified after his death. On his deathbed, he reportedly said, "I think I'm becoming a god." It's sort of this joke, I'm dying. Well, Domitian decided, they're going to deify me when I'm dead. That doesn't do me much good. I think they ought to do it right now. I should be deified now, not later. And so he began to demand that people consider him a god and treat him in that way and make a sort of a sacrifice to him. This is what put him into conflict with Christians, somewhat with Jews as well. And this led to persecution. There was persecution of Christians by Nero. After the fire in Rome, he blames it on Christians. There's certainly persecution of Christians by Domitian because he wants them to sacrifice and to say that he is Lord and God. Dominus et Deus. Lord and God. And of course, Christians refused to do that. When they refused to do it, they would give him a couple of chances and then they would put him to death. There's Dominus et Deus. By the way, this is also then the time period of the Apostle John, the one who writes down the Revelation, the last book of the New Testament. By the way, the New Testament's in the Bible. In case you didn't know, it's the last book. And it begins with John writing that he is their brother in persecution, and I, John, saw these things. Behold, he comes. Okay, he sees Jesus, he says, he sees these visions or whatever. He writes them down. But he says, I, John, in persecution. He's on the island of Patmos. The island of Patmos is a Greek island off the shore of Turkey, and John was affiliated or lived in Ephesus, but he had been exiled to this little island about 50 miles away from Ephesus. Okay? So, this is John. By the way, Mary was connected with John. You remember on the cross when Jesus died? What did he say to John? What did he say? Remember at the cross, not too many people are there. There's two women named Mary, and there's a guy named John. That's it. Well, then the Roman soldier. And as he's on the cross, Jesus looks down at John, and he says, behold your mother. And he says to Mary, behold your son. Jesus is saying, take care of my mother. That's what he's saying. So John did take care of Mary. And we know John moves to Ephesus. There's a long history that he does, and that Mary came with him. And this is the place where Mary lived. John helped her. By this time, John had been pretty old. He was one of the youngest, if not the youngest, of the disciples. And by this time, we're up to 95, 94, 95. So he was probably in his 90s or late 80s. So instead of killing him, making him a martyr, they exiled him to the island of Patmos. Well, a lot more we could say there. Let's talk about Pompeii for a minute, shall we? Okay. Thanks for asking. What about Pompeii? Oh, let me tell you about it. See, I ask my own questions. That way I feel like we're participating more. Pompeii was buried in the eruption of a volcano in AD 79. In August, by the way, of AD 79, this volcano erupts. By the way, that volcano is still there and is still active. So someday I hope you get to go visit Pompeii. You'll be able to see Mount Vesuvius in the background. You can kind of see it there if you look carefully. You see that right there? It's kind of hard to see. A little bit darker blue right there. That's Mount Vesuvius. Some days it's easier to see than others, depending on the clouds and so forth. It's recorded by a guy named Pliny. Pliny the Elder records about the eruption and the destruction. And what this does is preserves a city, AD 79. So this is right in the time of Titus. It was kind of a wealthy city, but it's covered by ash. The people in this town are destroyed. But you know, archaeologists kind of like it when things get destroyed quickly, because it leaves all the stuff behind. People didn't have time to get everything out of town. They were trying to, but they didn't. They couldn't. And so this town, this city, has been preserved. And you can walk through the streets of this city. So if you ever get a chance to go, I recommend it. It's a huge city, and if you go on a tour, they're just going to take you through a little part of it. But they will take you by some of these restaurants. You walk by on the street, and here you can see an oven where they were baking bread, and they actually found bread still in the oven. Carbonized. They have counters that would have probably had some kind of a soup in it, right? Food. So you'd walk up to the counter, you'd get your bread and your soup, you'd eat your lunch, and go on your way. They had bedrooms where the beds were still preserved. They were carbonized. The out frame of the bed, you can still see it. This is the amphitheater, which is all filled. And even the people you can see. These people, what happened here, I don't know if you can see it clearly, maybe this will help. See, here's a guy leaning on his arm. These are people laying here, often next to two people embracing, probably a husband and wife. Because as this ash fell, poison gas was released. So basically these people died because they couldn't breathe. They're breathing in that gas and they die. And as they get weaker and weaker, they're trying to get away. They're often together, so we see families like here's a child. Here's maybe a husband, wife, and a child. Here's a guy trying to get up, but he can't. You see dogs like this too, dogs, other animals that they had pets. So as they were digging down through the ash, they noticed they would come to this hollow area, and inside were bones. Human bones. So somebody got the idea, hey, when we come to this hollow area, let's get plaster of Paris, we'll mix it up, and we'll pour it into the hole. We'll let it sit for a few days, then we'll come back and dig around it. And when we do, when they did, this is what they found. The outlines of bodies. Because inside of that plaster are the bones. There's a few of them that they have done in more recent times where they actually did it with a sort of polyurethane, a sort of see-through. It's clear. You can see the bones inside. So we can actually see some of the victims of Pompeii. We certainly can see their stuff. A lot more we could say there, but we have to move on. Now we come after this time, after the time of Domitian, we come to what are sometimes called the 5 good emperors. The 5 good emperors. They were tired of Domitian, a young sort of punk, being a... Yeah, tell him I said hi. Nerva was an older guy. You know, one thing about having a young emperor, since they're going to be emperor till they die, is that, you know, they usually don't die very soon. Unless you have to encourage them, right? But Nerva was already pretty old, and then he died a couple years later. And then that brings in Trajan. Trajan was an experienced military guy. Notice he reigns for 19 years. He will adopt, and he started to get the idea that maybe what we should do is adopt somebody instead of having a blood relative. We'll kind of pick somebody we think would be a good leader, and I'll adopt them to assure that you have a smooth transition, we don't go into a civil war. So that's what Trajan did. He adopted really his cousin, Hadrian, and Hadrian then becomes the next emperor in 117. And notice he's emperor for, what, 21 years. By the way, Hadrian has the distinction of being the first emperor who was from outside of the Italian peninsula. He was actually born in Spain. Hadrian will have extensive building campaigns. He'll travel all around the empire, trying to visit everything. He loved Greek culture. He orders the building of a wall in England. You've heard of Hadrian's Wall? Sort of separated those wild Scots in the north from everybody else. Last summer I spent about 3 weeks in England, and I was digging near Hadrian's Wall. Well, Antonius Pius, after that, will reign, as you can see here, for what, about 24 years? So we have a kind of stable time here after Domitian. Long rule of fairly stable and good emperors. And so this is a good time. The early 2nd century is a time of relative peace and prosperity for Rome. Now the next one, the 5th, I guess. Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 5 good emperors is Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius, emperor for 19 years, was a philosopher, a Stoic philosopher. But things begin to change during his reign. He has to spend a lot of his time defending the borders of Rome, putting down rebellions, especially the Germanic people to the north. Yes?
Isn't that the emperor that died in Gladiator?
Oh, I knew somebody would bring that up. Yes, that's the guy. Yeah, notice they show him in a tent, like he's out on the battlefield, and they actually showed his son killing him, really, is what happened. Yeah, there's not much of that movie is historical. The fact about Marcus Aurelius being out on the battlefield fighting Germanic people, that part is true. And then they kind of show him at night writing in his tent, writing in his, I don't know if you saw that, but they have him writing. That's actually where he wrote his philosophy. He wrote it while he was on the battlefield. And you can still read it. It's called Meditations. But the guy that they had as his son really wasn't his son. And his death really wasn't the same. And a guy named, I'm sorry to tell you, a guy named Maximus did not exist. And the idea that Maximus was going to restore the Republic, no, that was also not true. But I like the movie Gladiator. But yeah. And it gets you to study it. You can study Marcus Aurelius and his son. His son was not worth much, that is true. Well, Marcus Aurelius will begin persecuting Christians. Why? Because they started to see something had changed. Rome was beginning to have more and more troubles, especially along the borders. And as some people looked at it, they said, what has changed with Rome? One of the things that had definitely changed in Rome was Christianity. Christianity began with just, 12, 13, 14 people, then maybe 20, then maybe a couple of hundred. It was in a little place called Palestine. But now Christianity had spread across the Roman Empire. And what many people began to say, or at least some people began to say, like Marcus Aurelius, is that the Roman gods are upset with us because we're not venerating them, we're not honoring them the way we used to because of this Christianity which keeps people away from the temple. I put this up here just to remind us that these three empires that we've talked about, the Gupta, the Han, and the Roman, all exist at the same time. How long are we going? 1:15. Okay, good. Well, we've time to come to talk about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Very sad. What happens is, after the reign of Marcus Aurelius, I'm not going to list a whole bunch of emperors for you for the rest of the time. I might mention a couple, I think. I know I did mention a couple. But we start to have an awful lot of emperors. And they don't last very long. And most of them do not die of natural causes. They are assassinated. And so what we see then, the Severan rulers, which notice that's about what? 39, 30, it's less than 40 years. We see the Severan rulers, these are called the military monarchies, where these guys just stay out on the battlefield putting down trouble. Rebellion in Germany, rebellion in Spain, rebellion here, rebellion there. They're always out fighting, just trying to maintain the Roman territory. A lot of trouble on the borders. A lot of people trying to move in. A lot of motion. People coming from the steppes of Russia moving in. People coming primarily from the east and moving west. Why are they moving? Some people say it was the climate had changed. The climate has changed several times. And so they're looking for warmer places, more food. They might also be being pushed by other people behind them. There were many civil wars. Just to give you an idea, between 235 and 285, there were 22 emperors. Now, see, that's about what? That's not even 60 years, right? You got 22 emperors in 60 years, less than 60 years. That means each emperor is not even lasting 3 years. They're lasting, about 2.5 years. And there was only 2 of those 22 emperors that was not assassinated. Start to see the problem? Great upheaval. Rome is in a lot of trouble as we approach what this would be the 3rd century, and things were beginning to fall apart. Now here's the other thing. The Roman military was different than our military in that our military, people are paid, they are paid by the government, right? So if you signed up for the army or whatever, you would expect you're going to get a paycheck at least every month, right? You would also expect that they were going to give you your uniform. They would provide you with the equipment you need, your weapons or whatever. They would also give you a place to sleep. They'd also give you food. They'd also give you medical care. I mean, they're giving you quite a bit. When you sign out, of course, they often ask quite a bit, but they're giving you quite a bit. The Roman soldier didn't get any of that. There was no, well, I wouldn't say never, but often there was not regular pay. Often they did not get provided all the kinds of things which soldiers today are accustomed to. And often you had to wait until after the battle, and then we defeat the enemy, and then we take the enemy's stuff and we divide it up between us. That was your pay. And then maybe at the end, if you lasted long enough and you were a veteran after 25 years, you would get a piece of land that you could call your own. And then you could settle down, if you're still alive, and have a farm or whatever you wanted to do. Okay? But the problem is, armies need pay. And the best way to get the pay, the easiest way to get the pay for the armies, is to conquer somebody else. You see? You conquer the enemy and you take the enemy's stuff and you give it to the soldiers. That's how they did it. Now here the Romans are not conquering anybody. They haven't conquered anybody in a long time. In fact, all they're trying to do is maintain their territory from people trying to come into their territory and take it from them. That means we no longer have that kind of built-in pay for the army. So it gets to be tougher. Okay? Also, it gets harder and harder for, a lot of Romans didn't want to have a lot of children, and so now we need a lot of people in the army. So what are we going to do? They start offering people citizenship if they're in the army. So we start to see that since we're in desperate need of people in the military, people that we had just recently conquered were now going to be in the army and are going to be guarding the area. It was sort of their home area, and they're going to be guarding it, protecting it from people that are very similar to themselves. That is, one Germanic group guarding against another Germanic group, for example. A lot of problems with that, potentially and actually. Now here's a place called Bath. It's a Roman bath. This is in a town called Bath. If you go to England, you might want to go visit. I would recommend going to visit Bath, England. Some of you have heard of a woman named Jane Austen. You ever heard of her? Some of you might like Jane Austen and all her zombie friends. I hear she's got a book now with zombies. Or they've taken Jane Austen and made all the characters into zombies. Anyway, Jane Austen lived in Bath. You can go visit places where she stayed and all that kind of stuff. I don't care if you do that stuff. But you need to go to the Roman bath. Here's a street level. Down below it is the Roman level. This is probably the best preserved Roman bath in the world. The water is still in it. It still functions. You go in and you can visit it, go all around and see all the different rooms and so forth. This water is coming from a natural hot spring, and the bath hot spring water is served inside a fancy restaurant here. It's supposed to have medicinal purposes. You can get, if you go on the tour, they'll give you a little paper cup and you can drink some of it. I did. It was delicious. By the way, it's Bath. But the British don't. They say Bath. Bath. And then they'll say, you Americans, you take everything. You even take a bath. We British bathe. Oh, there you go. Well, let's see. We've just got a couple slides left, so let's see if we can get it done. We've got about 6 minutes. So let's talk about what happens then later on. We've had all this upheaval. Here's a guy that's going to try to fix things in Rome and try to bring them back again. In the late 3rd, early 4th century, his name is Diocletian. Diocletian decides that, Rome needs additional, he needs help. So he's the main guy, but he gets 3 other guys to help him. And so he divides it. Here we see the Tetrarchy, the 4. By the way, if you want to see this, you got to go to Venice. This was in Constantinople, but when the people of Italy took over Constantinople, they brought this back and they built it into the corner of their building. So this is outside. It's made from a very lovely purple stone, a porphyry. Anyway, he creates a tetrarchy. He divides the empire into 4 units. One of those units is controlled by this guy, Constantine's father. And when Constantine's father dies, Constantine gets involved. What happens is what I don't think Diocletian had counted on is that when he created this, that the guys after him, when he died, would all fight amongst themselves to take the power, and that's what they did. Eventually, Constantine is going to take the power. I'm making a long story shorter. Constantine is actually crowned ruler in England, up in York. And then he marches down and he does battle. He says he sees a sign in the sky, in hoc signo vincit. In this sign, conquer. And it's a sign of the Chi Rho. Do you know what the Chi Rho is? It looks like an X with a kind of a P coming out of it. You know what I'm saying? I don't have a marker here. Yes, I do. Do it. Oh, looks like it's very dry. Yeah, it's very dry. Well, you get the idea. It's an X, and it's something that looks like a P going up through it, right? That's called a chi. That's what the X is. Rho, which is the R sound. These are the first two letters of Christ. And so Christus starts with a chi rho. So this becomes an ancient symbol for Christianity. Constantine says he sees it in the sky, and in this sign, conquer. He does. He will eventually convert to Christianity, but Christians had been severely persecuted during this later period of Decius down to Diocletian, and he's going to end the persecution. His mother was a Christian, by the way. Her name is Helena. That is Constantine's mother. He will move the capital to what today would be Istanbul, Turkey. He will build up that city, and he'll name it after himself, call it Constantinople for Constantine. And he will try to bring order to the church. In the Edict of Milan in 313, he will declare that all religions are legal within Rome. So that includes Christianity. So he doesn't make Christianity the official religion. What he does is he makes it a legitimate religion. And now what we have seen is eventually Christianity will become the official religion of Rome. It started off with just a handful. It definitely was persecuted for many, many years. But by the time you get to Constantine and then shortly thereafter under Theodosius, that's when Christianity becomes the official religion of Rome. Theodosius, yeah. Theodosius will make it the official religion. And so what that means is it's against the law to be anything but a Christian. That's not what Constantine had said. So we come full circle. At first it was illegal to be a Christian, now it's illegal not to be a Christian. This is sometimes called the triumph of Christianity, but it brings with it its own challenges. Because now that Christianity is legal, well, it's sometimes easier to become a Christian, and corruption and so forth goes in. Here's our last screen of today. I'll put it all up here. There it is. We'll finish with this. We still got a couple of minutes, so that's good. Because what's going to happen now is we have lots of people who are going to be moving in from the Germanic areas to the north and from the east. And as they move in, these groups called the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Vandals and so forth, and later the Huns, these people are going to wreak havoc on the Roman territory and the Roman Empire. They will finally sack Rome in 410, the Visigoths. The Vandals will also attack Rome. That's where we get our word vandalism. They came in and destroyed things. And so most people would say, when is the last Roman emperor? They would call it this guy, Romulus Augustulus, 475 to 476, last Western Roman emperor, and we see the fall of Rome. All right, we're going to leave it there. Don't forget, test by Sunday night. I'll post this later.